Chapter 3, The Promise That Wouldn't Let Him Go. The funeral was held 3 days later. The sky was gray. Heavy clouds stretched endlessly overhead, as if the heavens themselves had come to mourn. Rows of police officers stood at attention in perfectly pressed dress uniforms. Their polished badges reflected the dim morning light. Edward stood in the front row. His eyes never left Daniel Carter's casket. The same young detective who had laughed with him over coffee only days earlier now rested beneath a folded American flag. The bagpipes began to play. Their haunting melody drifted slowly through the cemetery. Claire sat beside Daniel's parents. She looked completely hollow. The engagement ring Edward had found inside Daniel's jacket rested tightly in her trembling hand. She hadn't cried. Not once. Sometimes, pain is simply too deep for tears. The chaplain stepped forward. Detective Daniel Carter dedicated his life to protecting people he had never met. He died doing exactly that. Edward slowly lowered his head. No, Daniel hadn't died protecting strangers. He had died protecting him. That thought refused to leave Edward's mind. Later that afternoon, Edward sat alone inside his office. Daniel's desk remained exactly as he had left it. His coffee mug, his notebook, his detective's badge, even the terrible handwriting inside his open case file. Everything looked normal, except Daniel wasn't coming back. Edward opened his desk drawer and removed the robbery case file. He spread every crime scene photograph across his desk. Blood stains, shattered glass, the escape route, shell casings. His eyes moved from one photograph to another. Something wasn't right. Then they stopped. A surveillance image. The suspects had entered the jewelry store at exactly 11:36. Yet, the alarm wasn't triggered until 11:42. 6 minutes. Edward leaned closer. Why would experienced robbers wait 6 full minutes before taking control of the store? His heartbeat slowed. His mind raced. Then he whispered, "They weren't there for the jewelry." A knock echoed through the office. The door opened. Chief Robert Harper stepped inside. "You should go home." Edward never looked up. "I'm working." "No." The chief let out a tired sigh. "You're grieving." Edward quietly closed the folder. "I'm fine." The chief shook his head. "No, you're not." Silence settled over the room. Finally, the chief spoke again. "The task force has a suspect." Edward looked up. "What suspect?" "We found the murder weapon in an abandoned apartment." Edward frowned. "Whose apartment?" "A career criminal named Victor Salazar." Edward's expression hardened. "No." The chief folded his arms. "The ballistics match. The fingerprints match. The district attorney is preparing charges." Edward slowly shook his head. "No." The chief's patience began wearing thin. "What do you mean, no?" Edward pointed toward the surveillance photographs. "There were 4 robbers. We've arrested one. The getaway SUV had fake registration plates. They disabled the alarm before entering. They knew exactly where the high-value diamonds were stored." He looked directly at the chief. "This wasn't a random robbery. It was planned. By professionals." The chief remained silent. Edward continued. "Victor Salazar isn't smart enough to organize something like this. He didn't kill Daniel." The chief sighed. "Sometimes, the person we catch is the person we get." Edward slowly stood. "No. The man who killed Daniel Carter is still out there." 2 weeks later, the department officially closed the investigation. According to the report, the Gold Crown Jewelers robbery had been solved. Victor Salazar accepted a plea deal. The newspapers called it another victory for major crimes. The city moved on. Everyone moved on. Everyone, except Edward. 6 months passed. Not a single armed robbery occurred anywhere in the city. Most detectives welcomed the silence. Edward hated it. Every morning began exactly the same. Coffee, case file, crime scene photographs, a police scanner. Every evening ended exactly the same. Coffee, case file, police scanner. The scanner became the soundtrack of his life. Every burst of static made his heart race. Every emergency dispatch pulled his attention away. Every robbery call, even 1 mile away, made him stop everything. Mirabel noticed first. "Dinner's ready." "I'm coming." 5 minutes later, he was still staring at the scanner. "Ethan's asking for you." "I'm coming." 10 minutes passed. He still hadn't moved. The food grew cold. The silence grew louder. One Saturday morning, Ethan walked into the living room wearing his basketball uniform. "Dad?" Edward barely looked away from the surveillance footage. "Hmm? My game starts in an hour." Edward smiled, without looking up. "I'll be there." Ethan hesitated. "You promise?" Edward finally looked at him. "I promise." A smile spread across Ethan's face. Mirabel smiled too. She wanted to believe him. 40 minutes later, Edward slipped on his jacket. Then, the police scanner crackled. "Possible armed robbery." Edward froze. "Downtown Financial District." His pulse quickened. Mirabel's smile disappeared. Edward reached for his car keys. "Edward." He stopped. "It's probably nothing." She walked toward him. "You promised Ethan." Edward looked at his son. Then, at the scanner. Then, back at Ethan. "I'll make it." He leaned down and kissed Ethan gently on the forehead. "I'll be there before tip-off." He turned, opened the front door, and walked away. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house. Ethan stood silently beside the window, watching his father's car disappear down the street. 5 minutes passed. Then, 10. Finally. Ethan quietly bent down, untied his basketball shoes, slipped them off without saying a single word. He picked them up and slowly walked back to his bedroom. Mirabel watched him disappear down the hallway. Her heart broke, not because Edward had left, but because Ethan no longer looked surprised. He looked used to it, and somehow that frightened her more than anything. End of chapter 3.